Welcome to the Kind Leader Podcast, where empathy meets action in the world of leadership. Your host, Gino DeGregory, engages with innovators and seasoned professionals from diverse sectors, all demonstrating the power of leading with kindness. And now, your host, Gino DeGregory.
Welcome to the Kind Leader Podcast. I'm your host, Gino DeGregory. On this podcast, we explore how kindness, self-awareness, and leadership come together to create meaningful impact. Today's episode is about breaking free from micromanagement and transforming teams into high-performing independent units. Our guest, Chris Seifert, is the founder of Enabling Empowerment, an organization dedicated to helping leaders reclaim their time and focus by fostering cultures of ownership and accountability. He has over 20 years of experience in many industries, and his micromanagement doom loop concept inspires leaders to rethink teams' dynamics, decision-making, and strategic focus. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you here. To start, could you share a bit about your journey and what inspires you to create Enabling Empowerment?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Gino. It's a pleasure and honor to be able to talk to your audience. So, as you mentioned, I spent over 20 plus years in industry. I actually started my career in the U.S. Navy in the submarine force, spent 8 years on active duty, transitioned out of that into manufacturing. I've worked for Owens Corning, Georgia Pacific as a plant manager. In my last operational role, I was vice president of operations for a large biomass manufacturer. Had 14 facilities that I was responsible for, about 1,100 folks reporting up through the operations organization. And then in the middle of that, I also spent about 6 years in consulting, doing culture transformation, management system implementations in high hazard industries like oil and gas, chemical, and other energy companies. So one of the things that I noticed throughout my career that I found that teams, folks really struggled with was decision making, right? And I, by nature, I'm a person. I mean, I want to be able to empower my teams. I want my teams to be able to make more of the decisions. I don't want them coming to me constantly asking me what they should do, how they should do it. But in order for them to be able to do that, they had to be good at making decisions, right? And what I found was when I would try to give that, authority to people, they were either not prepared for it and started making really bad decisions, or they just weren't very confident in their own ability, and so they were reluctant to take that authority on. And so, over the course of my career, early in my career, I got introduced to the concept of having a decision-making framework, so having a process that I use to make decisions. And I've found over my career that by teaching that to my teams and people that work for me, that I was able to give them more responsibility and authority. In fact, I'll tell you also personally, just using that framework myself was a big reason for, my own success in my career. I mean, I've had, my CEO at the last company I worked for gave me specific feedback that, Chris, your ability to articulate how you came to a decision is part of why I trust you to make decisions, right? So a couple years ago, I decided, hey, look, I think people would benefit from learning how to use this framework. And so I set out to write a book, Enabling Empowerment, and started the firm to be able to take that book and help other leaders implement the decision-making framework on their teams.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Congratulations on all your success. And, that's a struggle I think a lot of leaders have too, right? Whether they're, out there in the world, kind of like how do you elevate and how do you enable and empower those things you were saying to your folks so they can become the leader, right, that you want them to be. And then the decision making is critical because a lot of the time is a lot of those problems, I think, or not problems, but lack of confidence or a lot of people in their heads and not knowing what to do, but having a framework really helps them get there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It can give them confidence in how to do it. And also, I'm sure we'll get into this, but, our brains aren't wired for making complex and uncertain decisions. They're not, right? There's a psychologist who the only psychologist to win the Nobel Prize for economics is named Daniel Kahneman, who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow, where he introduced the underlying theory of economics has been that people are rational decision makers. They try to optimize the situation for themselves. What Kahneman proved was that's not really true. The vast majority of decisions we make are unconscious. Like they're not. Like we use a lot of mental models and heuristics is what he calls them to make decisions. So we're not always thinking about what cause and effect are. We're thinking about correlation. And that causes us in complexity and uncertainty to make a lot of mistakes. And guess what businesses are? Right? They're complex and uncertain, right? And so using a framework to help you avoid those decision traps leads to a lot better decisions.
Yeah, definitely. Put a pin in there. I want to definitely dive deeper into that.
Sure.
All right. The first question that I love asking my guests here: what does being a kind leader mean to you?
Yeah. So let me contrast it. Give my definition by contrasting it with being a nice leader, because I think a lot of times they get confused. So kindness to me is when I care about somebody, like, authentically, right? I authentically care about that person's well-being and want to see them be as successful as they can. Whereas a nice leader is somebody who just wants people to like them, right? They just don't want to upset somebody. And the difference can be that when I'm being nice, maybe I hold back call it constructive feedback, right? That somebody really needs to hear, because it's their performance is not good, or they're not being successful. But maybe if I'm trying to be nice, I try to say it in a way that doesn't hurt their feelings, or I don't say it at all.
Right.
But a kind leader recognizes that it's critical that person gets that feedback, and they've got to give it to them, and they got to give it to them in a way that it lands, right? That they actually hear it and they can take action on it. But that means they also have to do it in a way that they'll receive it, that it will be viewed as constructive. And so I think that, to me, is the difference, is that true, authentically caring about the individual's well-being versus just wanting to be liked by somebody else.
I agree 100%. Is, everybody wants to be liked, right? At the end of the day, right?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely, that's one of the biggest challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the fear. It's like, I won't be alone, right? If I don't have any friends or anybody to talk to, right? That's like, I don't want to be like that, right? Or I want to be in that particular scenario. So I think that's a lot of those drivers. It's like, but to your point, and I agree, is it's about providing that constructive criticism in a way that lands, in the way that it's very hard to provide feedback if the other person is not ready to take it also, right? So it's not just providing the feedback, is finding the time and understanding the other side. And when are they ready? Sometimes someone is not ready to hear that feedback, right? So it's so many different dynamics. But I do appreciate your definition. But is there a particular scenario or story that you have that you experienced, or somebody was a kind leader to you in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll give you an example where I think I demonstrated kindness, and it was a bit of a challenge. So I had one of the plants that I was responsible for as the vice president of operations, the ops manager at that plant, a very important role, the number 2 person in the plant. And he'd been a really great employee, but we started having issues where he was leaving at like 2:00 in the afternoon, 3:00 in the afternoon, and sometimes when the plant was in like a really bad condition, right? There'd been a malfunction or an issue, and he just all of a sudden would disappear. And, the plant manager had given him feedback, people giving him feedback. And so, I went and I sat down with him, but before just jumping, because look, to be honest, I was really frustrated, right? I mean, here we're paying this guy, he's got, paying him good money. He's got a substantial bonus opportunity. He just seems to be blowing his job off. I was pretty frustrated by it, but, I wanting to really understand it, I started out with saying, hey, I don't really know this guy, right? Because I don't think we spend enough time getting to actually know people. Right. And so I sat down with him. I said, would you mind just tell me about your life? Like, tell me about how it was as you grew up as a kid. And so he started, and what I learned was that his father had divorced his mother early in his life, and he basically was raised by a single mother. And he was in lots of sports in school, but his dad never attended any of his sporting events. And then it dawned on me, and I said, so I bet it's pretty important for you as a father to be at your kids' sporting events. And he said, very important. Yeah. And he said, I'm at all of them. That's why I'm leaving at those times. And, had I not had that conversation, I wouldn't have understood that. But then I was able to reframe it to him. And I said, listen, my dad was not at all my sporting events. He was busy because he was working, but he came to some. But I'll tell you what he did was he worked really hard, and he was able to help me go through college without any debt, and graduate without debt. And you know what I'm far more grateful for than the fact that I remember much more that I graduated with no debt than that he missed a few of my games, right?
Right.
And I said, listen, you're in a position right now where if you don't start performing, your ability to pay for your kids' college is going to be affected.
Right.
And I don't want to see that. And I'm telling you right now, your kids are going to remember that a whole lot more than whether or not you missed one of their games. So I'm not saying miss. I'm saying now that we understand how important this is to you, we can work with you to make it possible. But you also need to understand that there are times where you just need to be here, right? Like it just needs, because you're the leader of the plant. And boy, I'll tell you, we saw an incredible turnaround in his performance and the way his boss was relating to him just from that conversation. And had I not realized that, man, I need to back up and go all the way to this guy's childhood. Like, what is it that is causing this behavior?
Right.
I mean, I think if I just piled on like everybody else and said, you need to stay at work till the job's done, I don't think we would have saw any difference. He probably would have been terminated. His life would have been impacted. Our business would have been impacted. And but instead, he turned out to really grow from it.
Absolutely. That's a great story, Chris. I appreciate that, and it resonates well with a lot of things. The big thing that I kept thinking is connection.
Absolutely.
Is connecting with the individual, right? A lot of people, when you're navigating through challenges, you're talking, like you're hearing, you're not getting something from your employee. You start telling yourself stories too. Oh, he or she's not dedicated. He doesn't want the job. They don't want the job. Blah blah blah. Right? Without even talking to them, right? So you already create this scenario where they're slacking, they don't want to be here, or this is not important to them, without even talking to them, right?
Yeah, I think a lot and I don't know whether it's in the interest of, whether we want to call it political correctness or whatever, law, like it almost seems like it's not okay to ask people about that stuff anymore, right? Like it's definitely not an interview. You can't ask people if they have kids. You can't ask people if they're married. You can't ask that stuff, right? Yeah. And so now I think we just kind of take that into the rest of our working relationships. But at the end of the day, I mean, it's impaired. Like, I don't even think he realized what was driving his behavior until we had that conversation, right?
Yeah.
And so now, as a result, I mean, when I have a team working for me, I mean, I actually carve out time where I'm like, hey, I want each of us to explain to the rest of our team, why are we here? What am I here for? Right? Like, I mean, some of us have different personal goals, and that's fine, right? But we all need to understand them, and so that we can tailor how we're working together. So,
absolutely,
it's critical. If you want to be kind, you got to understand people's background.
Yeah, and that's the key, and that's the biggest key that I always kind of share with people. You really have to understand the other side. It's perspective, right? Perspective. And I tell this story all the time. It's like, if you were to stand in front of me and I'm looking at a number and I'm looking at a 6, you're looking at a 9. I will never understand that you're looking at a 9 if I don't see it from your eyes. Because from my eyes and my perspective, in my mind, it's a 6 all day long, no matter what. So once you realize that other people have other perspective, other experiences, other challenges, other things, you really connect with the individual, it opens up so much opportunities for collaboration, for better communication, for better, just people feel like, hey, I hear you, I see you, and you're not just a number, you're not just another person doing a task, or it's you're right. When you come into an organization, you can't ask certain questions, but once you're in there, you're there 8-10 hours a day, right? You're there more than you potentially spend with your family, right? So why not create that environment where people can truly feel that they care and feel like, hey, my career, and they really want me to succeed, right?
Right. Absolutely.
So we talked about decision-making framework. I like that because I think from my perspective, I feel like the way I make decisions, I'm a risk taker all day long. So I will be quick to make decisions in many areas in my life, right? And I don't know if I share this with you. As a pilot too, I've been flying for 13 plus years. Decision making is something they teach also as pilots. You have to understand and make decisions, and your decision making, especially in situations where they're tough, like for example, you lose an engine or something goes wrong, your mind is racing. You can't be fearful of those things, and you go down to the level of training that you were able to get to. So, we'd love to expand on that decision making framework to help kind of leaders, especially in the organization, how they can help others, right?
Sure. So let me just talk about, first off, why a decision-making framework. As I mentioned, so our brains are subject to these decision traps that just come from the way they work, right? And so Kahneman describes it as we have two systems for thinking: system one and system two, right? Very, very complex names. But think of system one is how your brain, the mode your brain is always in, right? It's constantly taking in information. It's comparing that information to past information. It's creating a story, and it's saying, this is what I need to do. And so if I was just to, hold up a picture of a angry person in front of you, you would recognize right away they're angry because you've seen many angry people before, and you would start making decisions about, hey, I need to be careful here, right? I need to react in a certain way.
Right.
And your brain has a high capacity for those kinds of decisions. When you're driving down the road, you're constantly taking in information about how close this car is or where this other car is and what you need to do. And you're making decisions, but they're almost unconscious, right? Then we have system two. And system two is, if I was to ask you to multiply 17 times 19, right? That's not effortless. That requires some effort and some concentration. And in fact, once you start thinking about that, you can't think about other things, right? In order to make that kind of a decision. And so the relationship between these two systems is that system one is always on and system two is really lazy. It doesn't want to engage, because if it did, you'd end up stopped in the middle of the highway, right? So, but the problem is when we get faced with complexity or uncertainty, that's not good, right? We need to engage system two. And having a decision-making framework is a way to slow down our thinking process and engage system two on purpose, so we can avoid those mistakes that we make by correlation, right? And so, the decision-making framework that I teach people is just a process for, hey, I need to make a decision about something.
Yeah.
So first, how do I frame this problem or opportunity? Because the way I frame it has a big impact on the decision that I make. I'll just give you a quick example. Do you know how to pronounce the capital of Kentucky? Do you pronounce it Louisville or Louisville?
I think it's Louisville.
Okay. So it's actually pronounced Frankfurt. Okay. Because Louisville is not the capital of Kentucky. Frankfurt is the capital of Kentucky. But the way I frame that question, right?
Yeah.
The way I frame that question trapped you.
Yes,
because the minute I asked you, how do you pronounce it? You stopped worrying about whether it was actually the capital or not. Right.
Yep.
And I've done that question with people who live in Kentucky, and they will adamantly defend one of those answers or pick another, like they'll come with Louisville, right? And, something with marbles in their mouth. Yeah. And then I'll tell them it's Frankfurt, and they're like, oh, darn it, I know that, And so that's just to show you how critical, like that's the base. Many of our mistakes come right from there, from how we frame the problem. So the first step is, how do we frame the problem? The second one is, how do we brainstorm alternatives in a way that we aren't being biased? So brainstorm our alternatives. Then how do we identify the couple variables that really matter to the decision? In any decision, there might be hundreds of variables that will impact it, but there's usually only a couple that really matter. That if we're right about these couple things, then we're going to be right about what to do. Right. Then the next step is to understand the risk. So what is the best case that could happen? What's the worst case that could happen? What can I do to capture the best case? What can I do to avoid the worst case? And then the next step is to quantify that and put a dollar value on it, since we're in a business that at the end of the day is what we're here for. So let's put a dollar value on these alternatives, and then we can pick the best one. And then the final step is, I call it to show your work. So let's write down what we just thought about so that later we can come back and evaluate how well we did. Because another decision trap is called hindsight bias, right? We all tend to believe that we could have known things that we couldn't. So one of the mistakes I see a lot of people make is, they judge the quality of a decision by the outcome. And you really can't do that. I mean, if I was to say to you, if I walk into a casino and I put $100 on black and I win, I mean, was that a good decision? No. Probably not. I mean, if I keep doing it, I'm not going to, right? It's not going to work out, right? Or another great one, if I drive home drunk from the bar and I got home and I didn't have an accident and I saved cab fare and my car's at my house in the morning, was that a good decision? No.
Yeah.
I mean, right? If I keep doing that, something bad's going to happen. So we need to judge a decision based on the quality of the analysis that we did with the information that was available at the time. And so part of writing down what we did as we went through that decision-making framework is so that later, if things go wrong, we can come back and say, is that something I could have known? Or, did I really do the best that I could do? A lot of times you find out, man, I couldn't have known, but then maybe you learn to look for other things in the future. So,
Right.
so that's the framework. And I typically help people say, hey, let's start by implementing this on big decisions. But even as you get practice doing it, it translates even to emergency scenarios like you were talking about, right? In an airplane.
Right.
I'll give you for instance, one of the steps in the process, as I mentioned, is brainstorming alternatives. And one of the decision traps that I've learned about is called anchoring. So anchoring means that we tend to place a lot of value on the first information we get. So whenever you're brainstorming in a group, the first person that throws out an idea, the group tends to anchor on that idea and have a difficult time moving off of it. So one time I was incident commander for a large industrial fire, and we had a scenario where this door was we were literally concerned it was going to explode. And I pulled a bunch of firefighters together real quick, and I said, we need to come up with ideas, but I want you all to come. You got 30 seconds in your head to think of an idea. Don't say it out loud. And they all thought. And then I said, now you're going to say your idea. We're not going to talk about it. We're just going to go around in a circle, say it, go. And first guy says, spray water on the door. Next guy's like, I don't remember what his solution was, but finally one of the guys said we could bury the door with dirt. And at first I was like, people were like, bury it with dirt. That's crazy. But then as we started going through the alternatives, guess which one turned out to be the best one was bury it with dirt, right?
Wow,
and we ended up doing it and ended up saving the facility because of that. And I don't think we would have ever thought of burying it with dirt if we hadn't taken that 30-second pause in the way that we think, right? And so it's those little things can really change how successful the decision is.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple of follow-up questions on that.
Sure.
The first one is, I think by defining those decision-making frameworks, I think essentially you will be able to create some sort of checklist too, right? To help you in future decision-making in a way, right?
Yeah.
Not only automatically, in your brain, right? But also like to support your business or that particular thing. What has worked in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. By documenting how you came to your decision, it absolutely, in the future, when you're faced with a similar decision, you can pull those old ones up and go, how did we think about this the last time and how did it turn out, right?
Yeah.
So it definitely helps with the continuous learning aspect and getting better at it.
And I'm an IT guy, so I'm like, with this ChatGPT and AI and stuff like that, a lot of these are decision makings, right? Like essentially, as we start enabling and kind of sharing a lot of how we do this, right, is going to change a lot, right?
Yeah, look, that is a huge. I mean, I've spending a lot of time on that. I wrote one blog recently on it, but I'm working on some more. The problem is, it's impossible to keep up because a new model comes out every day, right?
Yeah, right.
But really, like, how well can we use these models for decision making, and how much are they susceptible to the same decision traps we are?
Exactly.
And also, how much do we introduce traps to them? So, for instance, in the way I frame my prompt to an AI, I'm introducing bias, right?
Yep.
We know it also hallucinates, right? Like it has a desire to give me an answer and make me happy. So even if it can't come up with one, it will make one up.
Right? Exactly.
So there are definitely risks. And I think we're a long way from understanding well enough to be able to turn it over.
Right.
But there definitely are ways that AI can help. For instance, that brainstorming alternatives is a great way, right? Like it can be a great way to bounce off and say, give me 10 ideas for how I can do this, right? Or give me 20 and really push its limits. And you can get them way faster than going around in a group. So there's definitely, a number of ways it can be helpful, but I think we're pretty far off from understanding it.
Absolutely. I didn't mean to take it too far into the technical side, but it was just when you started saying, especially with the anchoring, right? It's like, I thought automatically you said anchoring, the prompting, right? Is how you prompt. And even the question you laid out earlier about the capital of Kentucky, that's also another thinking. But anyways, the other question on the framework or for example, system one, would you agree or disagree that system one, essentially, as you get more experience, you're older, you're doing more things, that should increase with the knowledge and learning.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so system one's primary method of decision making is correlation, right?
Hmm.
So it's looking for, like, the last time this happened, what happened,
Yeah.
right? And oh, if it can match and it can tell a story, and if that story sounds good. So literally the way system one and two work together is system one is the first one, takes in the information, comes up with a story and a recommendation on what to do, and then system two briefly checks that story. And if the story sounds good, it goes, let it go, right?
Yeah.
And you act, and
Right.
without any of that thinking. And so definitely the more experienced you get, the better system one gets. I mean, that's what, is really happening with a professional athlete, like a baseball player swinging a bat, right? They're not engaging system two when they're thinking about, am I going to swing at this pitch?
Right.
Right. When you hear an athlete say the sport is slowing down for me, what they're really saying is system one is able to make these decisions now reliably, right? I'm not thinking about consciously, am I going to swing at this pitch? It's see ball, hit ball, right? Yep. I've seen this pitch so many times that I now know unconsciously that this is the pitch I want to swing at. Right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I like that. I'm I'm fascinated about this topic, to be honest. I'm gonna be reading.
Yeah.
You're coming up with a new book, right? Is that correct? That's coming out?
Yeah. So my book, Enabling Empowerment, same name as the company, was released in October. The audio version just came out this last week, so it's now available on Audible and Spotify.
And you talk about those decision making in the book, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I go through the decision traps, and I talk about the decision-making framework. And again, I mean, I would also highly encourage you to read Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. Keep in mind, it's written by a psychologist, and it's tough, right?
Right.
And so what I tried to do in my book was say, okay, he laid out the problem excellently, right?
Yeah.
Here's the problem. The problem is this is how our brains think.
Right.
But he didn't have a lot of solutions on what do I as a business leader do about this, right? And so that's what I try to take in my book is like, okay, hey, here's this great problem he's laid out, but what can I practically do? I mean, yes, I get it now. Anchoring is a thing, but what can I do as a leader to help my team avoid anchoring bias, right?
Absolutely.
And so that's where, like, the tip about, hey, when your team brainstorms, have them write down their thoughts before speaking them out loud so we don't contaminate each other's thinking.
Perfect. So let me bring it back to the kind leadership concept,
Sure.
and that this decision making. What is your advice for leaders out there, as they're either coming up or already in an organization, leading people, and they want to connect better, they want to be able to empower their people to be the right kind leader in their, in their field, with their customers, with their partners. How do you help me kind of connect the dots there?
Yeah. So my experience and what I've seen in industry is that, first off, you should have an intentional approach for improving the leadership capability of your team, right? Of your frontline leaders. And the organizations that do that, they often are investing in things like conflict resolution and performance feedback and, how to manage different team relationships. What I don't see them often covering, though, is how to be better at decision making, right? Which is a shame, because we're promoting people into leadership positions, and they're going to make more decisions as a result of that. And yet, what we're just assuming is they're going to learn by trial and error, right? And I don't think that's a good strategy, because decision making is a skill. I can learn it and I can practice it and I can get better at it. So why not do that in a way where it's safe, instead of, I make bad decisions and hurt the company and hurt, my team and other people. So that would be the number one thing, is if you want to empower your team. And look, I don't think the best long-term solution for your organization is to empower your team, and for you and for them. And that's not to say, let me just pause here. One thing that I think is a bit of a misunderstanding is, people will say, hey, people who are micromanaging are narcissists or jerks or just mean people, right?
Right.
And look, I'm not going to deny that sometimes that is the case, but it's usually not, right? Usually when people are micromanaging, it's because they feel like they have to. Like they're in a situation where the performance has been so bad that they just have to start telling people what to do, right? And I get it. I've been there. I've had to do it too. And it's a bad situation. It's what you got to do. But you got to have a strategy to get out of that, right? And part of that is teaching them to be better decision makers. And so, and look, not only is it better for your organization, it's better for their lives, right? I mean, think about if you're teaching them how to make better decisions at work, they're going to go home, make better decisions about their mortgage, about their kids' school, about life decisions. And so, you're improving their own lives as well. So that would be the main thing I would say. Be purposeful. I mean, the quality of decisions your team makes is going to have a dramatic impact on your organization's success. So be intentional about improving their decision-making skills.
Absolutely. So thanks for sharing that, Chris. And it resonates very well because the more you empower your team to do the right things in their craft, in their field, right, as well as become the better version of themselves and be a great leader, a kind leader from our perspective, and they embody their core values of that organization. I mean, imagine, right, if everybody is beating at the same drum and is all excited about impacting people and their customers. I mean, you can do anything, I feel like, right?
Well, look, I mean, they're going to be more engaged. I mean, so, there's a lot, again, another misnomer out there is that the people's engagement at work is determined by perks or, their compensation or how nice the leader talks to them or whatever, or their professional development. Look, at the end of the day, none of those things really matter. What matters is, do they believe in your mission, what you're trying to do? And do they believe they have the ability to influence it, right? They have to have both of those things. I can think your mission is great, but if I don't think I matter to it, I'm not going to give you extra effort, right? Yeah. But if I believe in your mission and I believe that my performance matters, then I'm going to sell out for it, right? Yeah. And look, I mean, I give you no better example than a United States Navy submarine. I served with 100 people that lived in a tube for months at a time, didn't talk to their families, terrible working conditions, very stressful. Frankly, the pay wasn't all that great, but people did it and they sold out for it. Why? Because they believed in what we were doing and they believed that them being there made it possible for that mission to happen, right?
Absolutely.
And so it's the same thing. And when you, even if instead of telling people what to do, you ask them to make a recommendation, the minute they do that, they now own the decision with you, right?
Yeah.
If I recommend that, if you say, Chris, what do you think we should do about this? And I say, well, Gino, I think we should do X, Y, Z. And if you say, oh, I agree, let's go do X, Y, Z. Well, I own that now. I mean, I recommended that to you.
Yeah.
So I am more motivated to make sure that X, Y, Z works. Right. Now, if you just tell me go do X, Y, Z and X, Y, Z doesn't work, what am I going to say? I mean, I just did what you told me, Gino.
Yeah.
That's your fault, not mine.
Yeah. Exactly.
So it's totally changes the dynamic.
I've experienced that. So for sure. Yeah. All right. So as we start, got a few more questions for you as we're wrapping it up.
Sure.
So I like asking this new thing I'm asking is rapid fire leadership insight. So what's one book every leader should read?
So look, I've already told you, I think Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, but I will give you another one that's a little bit off the beaten path. Eli Goldrat's The Choice. So you may be familiar with Eli Goldrat as the author of The Goal, The Theory of Constraints, which I thought was, one of the things I always think about a brilliant concept is when you kind of learn the concept and at the end of it, you're like, well, duh.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's when they're really brilliant. When you're like, this should have been so obvious to me. I mean, now I know it, but I didn't know it before you said it. And now I knew it. It's brilliant. And so the goal was always something that brilliant, but the choice is really about how he thinks about thinking, which obviously, as you can tell, that's something I'm very passionate about is decision making. And, it's very important to me to be thinking clearly about things. Right. And so The Choice by Eli Goldrat is another one where he's basically talks about how he chooses to think about things and how that has helped him. So
absolutely. The other question is, what's your favorite way to recharge or refocus?
Well, I like to go fishing. For me, it's quiet and it's like a battle. I do a lot of bass fishing, right? So it's not just throw bait in the water and wait for the fish to come get it. Bass fishing's more equivalent to hunting, right? You have to find them and then you got to trick them because they won't eat something that's dead. They only eat something that's alive. So you have to trick it into thinking this dead thing is alive. And it's just, I mean, for me, it's a great challenge in a way to kind of get my mind off other things and focus on something for a while.
Perfect. Appreciate that. What's one piece of advice you'd give to leaders struggling with micromanagement?
The first one would be to become allergic to the statement, "What do you want me to do?" And to never tell somebody, just don't stop telling people what to do. And I know that sounds really simple, but it can be very difficult. I had a plant manager. Often when I would visit plants, I would hang out in the plant manager's office, right? And so I was sitting in this one guy's office for about 3 or 4 hours working on something. And over the course of 3 or 4 hours, I saw at least a half a dozen people walk up to his door, knock on it, and say, "Hey, I got this problem. What do you want me to do?"
Yeah.
And he'd tell them what to do, and they'd leave and go do it. And they loved him for it, right? But I'm like, do you see what's happening here? Like, you are micromanaging. You are allowing them to make you make the decisions, right? And as a result, like, they're happy to do it because when it goes wrong, they can blame you. So you have got to learn, when somebody says, "What do you want me to do?" Your response needs to be, "I'd like you to make a recommendation. What do you think we should do?"
Yeah.
Right. So that it sounds simple, but it can be difficult to break that habit. And then obviously watch their reaction the first time you do it.
Right.
Because they'll look at you like, "You want me to do what?"
Yeah, right. Excellent. Thanks, Chris, for that rapid fire. As we're closing it up, one more question that I have before our final thoughts here is, if you could have coffee with anyone alive or from the past, who would it be and why?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think I would want to have, this is probably a little controversial, but I mean, I would have to say Jesus. I mean, like, here's the person that probably the most famous, influential person in history. And I'd like to sit down and get to the bottom of some stuff and find out.
Beautiful. I love it. Where can our listeners connect with you and learn more about your work?
Sure. So, the name of the book is, again, Enabling Empowerment. You can find it on Amazon. My website, same thing, www.enablingempowerment.com. In the book, there are, I go through the decision-making framework, and I also give you lots of tools and templates. So for instance, I have an Excel spreadsheet that I use as a financial model to evaluate decisions, right? You put the costs and the benefits in, it spits out the return on investment. So I talk about those things in the book, and then on the website, you can download them. You can download that spreadsheet. You can download those tools to help you make decisions. So that stuff's out there as well.
Beautiful. We'll definitely put that in the show notes and share those links. And I'm actually interested in downloading some of that, and we'll be reading your book too.
Great.
Any final message you'd like to leave with our audience today?
No, look, again, I just can't say it enough. I think we underestimate how important decision-making is. And I just encourage leaders to be thinking about, how am I making sure that my team is as good at decision-making as possible and not leaving it to chance.
Absolutely. Well, Chris, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and insight with us today. And to our audience, thank you all for listening to this podcast. I always welcome feedback. Super excited to, some great nuggets out of this session here, and looking forward for future episodes. With that, I'll leave you with: be kind, bring value, rise together. Have an amazing day, everybody.